Alrighty, ladies and gentlemen. So for today, the plan is to do a few things. As I mentioned in the teacher message, I want to take and go over the Alien and Sedition Act Webquest. I want to take and talk to you guys for a minute about the presidency of Thomas Jefferson. And then I want to give you guys a chance to work on the Louisiana Purchase Edpuzzle. So that's going to be kind of the three things that we're going to do today. And those are actually going to kind of be spread over the next couple of days. So we're only going to get through part of the Edpuzzle today. It's up if you would like to finish the Edpuzzle and have a little bit less to do for tomorrow. It's completely up to you, as I mentioned before. But that's 100% up to you. I know you guys have other classes to work on and you have other stuff to do, so I don't want to overwhelm you, which is why I kind of stretched this out over 2 days. So that's the plan for today. That's what we're going to be doing today, as I mentioned before. So what I want to do is I want to go ahead and I want to start off with the Alien and Sedition Act's Webquest. I'm not going to go ahead and go over every single question, guys. That's why I posted the answer key in Google Classroom for today's lesson. What I want to do is I really want to go ahead and I want to focus on certain questions that are going to help us to understand what the Alien and Sedition Acts were, and to a greater extent, what the presidency of John Adams was like, and what his relationship with France was like, and how that kind of took its course over the course of his presidency. So that's what I want to talk about, and that's what I want you guys to get out of this Webquest and this video and this part of the video today. So I'm opened already to the web page that you use to answer the questions for the Webquest, and we're going to go ahead and talk about those few key ones. Now, we know that John Adams started his presidency in 1796. That was when Washington read his farewell address. That was when Washington decided that he no longer wanted to be president, that he wanted to go back to being a private citizen. So John Adams ran for president and won the presidency in 1796. 2 years later, in 1798, that's when the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed, as you can see right here, guys. And I just read off the answer to question 1, by the way, for when were the Alien and Sedition Acts passed. They were passed in 1798. Now, what did these 4 laws do? We're going to look at these laws more specifically in each one that made up the Alien and Sedition Acts. But overall, the answer for question number 2 was that these 4 laws restricted the activities of foreign residents in the country and limited freedom of speech and of the press. And we can see that the 4 laws, which remain controversial to this day, restricted the activities of foreign residents in the country and limited freedom of speech and of the press. You can see that that's where I got the answer for number 2. So that was the idea, and those laws are really going to actually test the strength of the Constitution and the strength of the Bill of Rights, and how willing the government was to uphold those rights and to really kind of protect those rights for the people. So we're going to take a look at this and we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about this, but that is really going to test the Constitution and test kind of the resolve of men like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton, who had a hand in creating the Constitution in the first place. So that takes care of question number 2. Now, I want to go ahead and skip 3 and 4. We kind of already have an idea of really kind of who the Federalists were and who the Democratic Republicans were. The Democratic Republicans are really going to become, are really kind of evolved from the anti-Federalists, the ones that wanted, stronger state governments, a weaker national government. And the Federalists are who they have been since the Constitution was created. They want a strong national government. They know that, they believe that that's what the United States needs and what will help the United States to continue. So I want to skip those two. We just kind of went over those briefly. And I want to go ahead and move on to questions 5 and 6. Excuse me. Sorry, guys. So I want to move on to questions 5 and 6. Now, this is another aspect of John Adams' presidency, the XYZ Affair. This is something else that John Adams is known for, another event in his presidency that he's known for. And it really kind of stretches all the way back to Washington's presidency. So if we remember in 1793, Washington issued the Neutrality Proclamation, which said that the United States is going to be neutral in a conflict between France and England. If you guys remember, the French Revolution, it had kind of caused France and England to be at odds with each other and really kind of try to fight each other and led them to war. And Washington knew that the United States going into war would have really hurt the United States, and it would not have ended with the United States. He really felt that the United States would no longer be a country if the United States got involved in that war between England and France. So he tried to stay out. That really kind of aggravated the French and made the French upset with the United States. So when you fast forward to 1796 and we fast forward to John Adams' presidency, one of John Adams' goals was to try to mend the relationship between France and the United States. So the way that he does that is he sends 3 delegates to France to really try to mend that relationship. And he sends them to talk to the kind of representative of France, the foreign minister, a guy by the name of Charles Talleyrand. Talleyrand does not want to meet with the delegates of the United States. And instead, what he does is he sends his own 3 representatives to meet with these delegates that the United States has sent. And these delegates demand a $250,000 bribe and a loan for $10 million before any talks with Talleyrand and the French government could begin. This is going to really, really, really anger the government of the United States. It's going to anger the people of the United States. And it is going to be known as the XYZ Affair because when this incident was written up, the 3 representatives of France were labeled Representative X, Representative Y, Representative Z. So just to kind of not so much protect their identity, but rather just that they didn't necessarily know the names or kind of keep their privacy and stuff like that. But the point is that they were named this, and ultimately this event became known as the XYZ Affair, the demand for a $250,000 bribe and a $10 million loan by France, a demand on the United States. So if we look at number 5, what was the XYZ Affair? You'll find the answer in this paragraph right here. It details that Adams sent a 3-member delegation to Paris to meet with the foreign minister Talleyrand. Instead, 3 French representatives referred to in official U.S. documents as X, Y, and Z demanded a $250,000 bribe as well as a loan of $10 million before talks could begin. So that details exactly what the XYZ Affair was, and that's 100% exactly what, in a nutshell, summed up in a few lines exactly what the XYZ Affair was. Now, for question number 6, what effect did the XYZ Affair have on how Americans felt about the French? That answer is right here in this sentence. After the Americans refused, word of the so-called XYZ Affair spread at home, sparking outrage and calls for a war against France. So that was how Americans felt about the French after the XYZ Affair. You will find this just below this very pretty shoe. You'll find the answer just below the paragraph talking about the XYZ Affair. This one sentence right here that says that Americans were outraged and calls for war against France began. So that's the XYZ Affair. So Adams is already starting his presidency and already partway through his presidency on kind of bad footing because people are unhappy with the French and they're calling for war. And that's kind of something that Adams does not want to get involved in. He's going to take and prepare for it. He's going to get ready for it. But he's not going to actively send the Navy out across the Atlantic Ocean to begin a fight with France because he, like Washington, looks at that fight and believes that the United States is going to struggle, and there is a good chance that the United States will not come out of that fight with a victory and will end up losing its freedom. So he doesn't want to go to war with France over the XYZ affair, and doesn't want to because he's afraid that the United States is going to be defeated. So he prepares for it, but he tries not to actively seek it. So now that the XYZ affair has happened, and now that the XYZ affair has become an issue, you start to see some Democratic Republicans speak up and really try to kind of take issue with the way that Adams handled the XYZ affair, and they're also going to kind of take issue with the way that he is going to treat kind of people that immigrate to the United States. So before we really get into depth on that one, I want to make sure that we cover question number 8. What did the Naturalization Act do? So we can find the Naturalization Act right here in this paragraph, and the Naturalization Act increased residency requirements for U.S. citizenship to 14 years from 5. So if you want to apply for citizenship in the United States, you have to have lived in the United States for 14 years before you can take and apply to be a citizen. And that was to really kind of take and discourage any new people, any new immigrants from specifically France, as well as maybe other countries coming into the United States and applying for citizenship, saying they're a U.S. citizen, but still spying for that foreign country if, for example, the United States had ended up in war with France over the XYZ affair. So that was the one thing that was changed about the Naturalization Act and about the that was what the Naturalization Act was about. That was the point of the Naturalization Act. So we can see that the Naturalization Act really kind of took and raised that requirement in the view of the Federalists to kind of protect the United States. Now, for number 9, they also added another part to this, which was known as the Alien Enemies Act. And the Alien Enemies Act permitted the government to arrest and deport all male citizens of an enemy nation in the event of war. Now that, interestingly enough, is still on the books today and is still a law today. And they have expanded it to include women as well. But that is actually a law that is still on the books today, which does make some sense depending on your point of view. So when we say the Alien and Sedition Acts, when we kind of use that term and kind of blanket that and kind of to summarize the event and summarize the laws that were passed during the presidency of John Adams, under the Alien Act part of it, we include the Alien Enemies Act and the Naturalization Act. So that deals with immigrants and with foreigners from other nations and stuff like that. The Sedition Acts were slightly different. So if we look at question number 10, what did the Sedition Act do? The Sedition Act outlawed any false, scandalous, or malicious writing against Congress or the president and made it illegal to conspire to oppose any measure or measures of the government. So let me see. Most importantly, Congress passed the Sedition Act, which took direct aim at those who spoke out against Adams or the Federalist. Okay, So, all right. So even the bitter, let me see. Most importantly, Congress passed the Sedition Act, which, even as the bitter debates between the two fledgling political parties were being played out in rival newspapers, the new law outlawed any false scandalous. So that's where you'll actually find what was outlawed. Sorry, it took me a second to find that, guys. I forgot where I found it before. But the Sedition Act, you will find exactly what it outlawed: false, scandalous, and malicious writing against Congress or the president, and made it illegal to conspire to oppose any measure or measures of the government. Excuse me. So really, Adams is trying to kind of stop all opposition to what he's doing in his presidency. He's kind of tired of people criticizing him in the press and people in the Democratic Republicans criticizing the job he's doing. So along with the Alien Act, the Sedition Act is also passed. And that is something that is going to really, really anger the Democratic Republicans. And it's also going to be something that they are going to challenge and is going to test kind of the Constitution of the United States and kind of test how committed the United States is to upholding the Bill of Rights. So that is what the Alien and the Sedition Acts were. They were meant to protect the United States from immigrants, and they were meant to kind of stop any dissent or any disagreement about what the government was doing, stop the publishing of it so people didn't see it, people didn't read it, and those views could not be kind of expressed and passed on to anybody who might have agreed with that. So that's what the Alien and Sedition Acts were. So number 11, John Adams signed the Alien and Sedition Acts into law on July 14th, 1798. So more specifically, he signed the Sedition Act on July 14th, 1798. And that's when that law came into being and became official. So what was the main complaint against the Sedition Act? The main complaint against the Sedition Act was that the main purpose was to prevent people from speaking out against the government. So that was really kind of the issue that people had with the Sedition Act, and really what people didn't like about the Sedition Act. Okay, guys, sorry about the pause for 1 second. I just wanted to double check something. So for number 12, it looks like I actually have to, I will make sure that I change the answer key, and it'll reflect it after I finish recording this video. But the main complaint of the Sedition Act was that, and you'll see it right here, the Sedition Act violated the First Amendment to the Constitution, which protected freedom of speech and freedom of the press. So that was the main complaint and the main reason that the Democratic Republicans, did not like the Sedition Act. So this is going to be a huge controversy, and this is going to be an issue that both the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans are going to have. The Democratic Republicans are really not going to like this law, and the Federalists only want it in place so that the Democratic Republicans can't really criticize how they're kind of running the country and can't criticize their government. So questions 13 through 17 are really going to be all about who was prosecuted by the Alien and Sedition Acts, who got caught up in this, Matthew Lyon being one person that was actually tried and convicted of violating the Sedition Act. He ended up serving 4 months in jail and paid a $1,000 fine. James Callender was another person that was tried for violating the Alien and Sedition Act, mainly the Sedition Act, and 26 other people were prosecuted for violating the Alien and Sedition Act. So this is going to be something that is going to be on the books for John Adams' presidency, and it could be argued that that was a good reason that John Adams is going to lose the presidency in the election of 1800. Ultimately, the Alien and Sedition Acts, and fast forwarding to number 18, the Alien and Sedition Acts are going to ultimately be allowed to expire. So there was a set amount of years that the Alien and Sedition Acts were put into place, and then eventually it would be up to Congress to renew or continue the Alien and Sedition Acts or decide not to continue them anymore. And when Thomas Jefferson is elected in 1800, the year that the Alien and Sedition Acts expire is 1802. And Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans decide to allow that to happen because, in their view, these laws violate the First Amendment, freedom of speech, freedom of the press. So they decide to allow those laws to expire because their main concern is really upholding the Bill of Rights and keeping the people free and preventing the federal government from becoming too powerful. So that's really the story of the XYZ Affair and the Alien and Sedition Acts, and kind of why John Adams puts the Alien and Sedition Acts in place and why those two events happened in the first place. And those really do a great job of summing up John Adams' presidency. So now we have the election of 1800, and the reason that the election of 1800 is such a major, major event is because of the fact that that is the first time really in history that you see a bloodless transition of power. You have a political party, you have the Federalists that are in charge. They have been in charge since 1789. Washington was a Federalist. John Adams was a Federalist, and I'm trying to figure out how to show this and use the camera, guys. Sorry about that. Excuse me. Sorry about that, guys. So Washington is a Federalist. John Adams is a Federalist. Thomas Jefferson is a Democratic Republican. This is the first time that the Democratic Republicans are going to claim the presidency. And it could have been up to John Adams, and John Adams could have decided to go ahead and say, nope, I am declaring this election invalid. I'm going to hold on to the presidency. The Federalist Party will continue to be in charge. The Democratic Republicans will not be in charge. This transition will not happen. He could have absolutely done that. And that would have been the end of the United States as we know it. But luckily, John Adams decided not to do that. He decided to uphold the principles that the United States was founded on and the United States was built on. And he peacefully transitions power from himself to Thomas Jefferson. So now Thomas Jefferson is president of the United States, and he has a slightly different view of how the government should function and what the government should look like. And if we move over to this slide, to the Google Slides presentation, and if it will load, there we go. Perfect. So if we move over to the Google Slides presentation, we will see Jefferson's idea of government and his ideal view of what government should look like. Jefferson believed in a smaller government, in a smaller role for the national government, because if you remember, he believed that the state governments should have most of the power, and the federal government should really only be there as kind of a referee when needed. So Jefferson, when he gets into the office of the presidency, he decides to reduce taxes. He decides to reduce defense spending. That's what it means by defense expenditures. And he decides to reduce the national debt. So he drops the national debt from $83 million to $57 million. So over the course of Washington and Adams' presidency, things have come up that Washington and Adams and the government have needed to purchase. So that has kind of increased the debt that the United States was under. But Jefferson is determined to reduce that, and is able to reduce it by the end of his presidency to $57 million from $83 million. But ultimately, Jefferson's goal is to have a frugal and limited government. a penny-pinching, stingy, unwasteful, saving government. He wants the government to not really spend more than it needs to really kind of balance the budget, watch how much it's spending, and save the money it can. So that's Jefferson's goal. That's his idea for government. That is kind of what he tries to do and what he really wants to do. So Jefferson is going to shoot for these things and try to make sure that he reduces that. Now, the one very interesting thing, somebody who is a strict constructionist, somebody who believes that if the government does not allow, or the Constitution does not say you can do it, that means you can't. And somebody who is trying to be frugal and trying to really take and not spend more money than the United States has, Jefferson turns around and buys Louisiana for $15 million and doubles the size of the United States and does something that completely goes against his character, which is incredibly interesting for a guy like Thomas Jefferson, who really tries to stick to his principles and really kind of tries to stick to his guns. So it's interesting how you can have all these ideas and have all these goals, but sometimes, and you're going to see this as we go through the year and as you study more presidents and as you get into 8th grade, you're going to see how presidents sometimes have goals and sometimes have ideas, but when they become president and when certain situations come up, they ultimately decide to make decisions based on what's best for the country that might go completely against their values and their beliefs and their ideas. And this is a perfect example of that, where Jefferson is really trying to be kind of create a government that is going to save a lot of money and not spend a lot of money. And all of a sudden he spends $15 million and decides to buy tons of land. So that is just kind of an interesting kind of difference between what Jefferson wants to do and what Jefferson does. Now, it helps us to understand that Jefferson believes that the economy should be based on farming. And if you add a bunch of land to the United States, that's going to give those citizen farmers a chance to grow crops and a chance to kind of build their farms and stuff like that. So that becomes at least a little more understandable. But it's interesting at least to see that you come into the presidency with a goal and then events kind of pop up as you are serving in the job to ultimately take and change how you do things and how you decide to serve in that job as president. So that takes care of how Jefferson was going to serve as president and what his goal was to serve as president. And we talked actually a little extra about Jefferson deciding to buy Louisiana from France and from Napoleon for $15 million. Excuse me. So what we are going to do now, guys, and what you're going to do now is you're going to go ahead and click on the link to go ahead and watch that Edpuzzle and watch that documentary on the Lewis and Clark expedition, because now that Jefferson has bought Louisiana, he needs to figure out what's there and figure out what the land is like. And that's what Lewis and Clark are going to do. All right, guys, you may go ahead and click on the link to take you to the Edpuzzle. Take your time. You guys can space it out however you want. If you have any questions, please reach out to me, and I will make sure that I get back to you as quickly as I can. All right, guys, have a fantastic day.